So let us begin with the second section of this particular poem, when you will find that this particular naming procedure, this particular reference to naming, has been to some extent criticized or being mocked at by the poet. Here he says that when they name these bays. So ultimately, what we can identify, what we can find in this particular process, that whenever the naming takes place, as I identified just beforehand, that when the naming takes place, fundamentally with the process of naming, you are gaining some superiority over the native people. And fundamentally what happens, in some places it is very common that this particular naming is no longer to be considered as important, because without your name it had an own existence. And when you are just naming something, when you are just giving a particular name to something, then though you are trying to provide any external impulse to that, you're trying to add any external dimension to that, but ultimately beforehand it was also being considered to be the same. So here it has been pointed out that when they name these bays, so ultimately when you are calling a bay or bays, so without this particular naming, can you consider that beforehand it doesn't mean anything, or it didn't mean anything? It is not so. So ultimately the naming process, okay, does it to some extent provide an extra dimension to it? Does it provide an extra identity to it? Does it refer to any different meaning to it? No. But ultimately, with the particular process of giving the naming, you are gaining a superior identity, okay, or orientation. That's why it has been pointed out, and when they named these bays, was it nostalgia or irony? So fundamentally, you will find that this particular reference to nostalgia and irony, here you can identify that the poet rhetorically, it's a kind of a rhetorical question. If you think in terms of nostalgia, then you will find nostalgic for what? When a person is feeling nostalgic, certainly it is giving us the reference that you are nostalgic regarding your past. So fundamentally what happens when the settlers are coming from the native lands to the new islands or new countries, they're trying to name these places according to their own native land, that means from where they're coming. And they feel a kind of nostalgic past. And being nostalgic, being capable of feeling that particular formation of nostalgia, they are trying to create this place, the present place, just like home, because they actually trying to feel like home. So this homely feeling or homely orientation, it has been done in terms of the naming process. And that's why, is it a kind of a nostalgia or it's a kind of an irony? Now, as I mentioned that it is a kind of a rhetorical question, to be specific. What happens, that whenever we read any rhetorical question, certainly an answer is always mentally supplied to that. Now, what happens, that the poet rhetorically asks if the naming of the new world by the colonizer is driven by the nostalgia for a European past, or else is it an irony that affirms the stark difference between Europe and the new world? So when you are naming, does it simply refer to a kind of nostalgic orientation to it, to the process of naming? Or rather, when you are trying to name any particular place according to your own choice, according to your, the motherland or maybe the fatherland, and then fundamentally, is it an irony? Because with a particular reference to the differences, okay, the fundamental differences, you will find certainly that somehow the difference has been marked here. So you are trying to make it similar, but rather the irony is there that with a particular reference to the naming, it contrarily, it is referring to the difference between the actual one and the newer one. So that there lies the irony. So either whether it is the matter with the nostalgia, or it becomes something ironic that in place of the resemblance, in place of the similarity, it actually focuses to the differences. There lies the irony. And that particular irony is being pointed out in the next few lines here. It says, in the uncombed forest. So ultimately you can identify that the particular reference is providing in terms of some, it's a kind of personification to some extent, it's a personal metaphor to some extent. Because if you think in terms of the forest, you will find that it's called uncombed forest. That means probably it is giving us the hint that it is the untrodden territory. So ultimately it is possible that there is no particular presence of any human being there. So in the uncombed forest, in uncultivated grass, where was the elegance except in their mockery? So what happens, that when you say, for example, if you are a colonist, if you are a settler, and now you are entering into the forest, now you are entering into a particular field, probably in your own choice, it is being considered as in the Australian term, they were considered as terranalis, Terranalis. I have referred to the particular term terranalis when I was discussing on David Maliouf. Now, what happened, the terranalis, this particular term, it actually indicates a particular land is completely uninhabited. Okay. So whenever a colonist is trying to set up a particular colony in any terranalis or maybe a vacant place, then fundamentally it says or it shows that, okay, this particular place is vacant, there is no other person is present there. So therefore you can just go there and you can settle there. But it is not a true case, you see. Because if you go with the history part, if you go with the original part, then ultimately you will find that this is not a kind of a vacant place, to be specific. Rather, it is signifying that somehow it's a kind of a different orientation to the colonialist practice. It's a kind of a justification that has been provided. Because these are actually indicating to some extent the post-colonial orientation to such kind of colonialist practice and so. We find that to some extent that there are the people, okay, the indigenous people, and deliberately the settler actually erases their history and it has been produced as this particular place is quote unquote uncombed. These are the places which are completely uncultivated. So the newer one, the newer people, they are coming there, they're settling there, they're just nourishing them, nourishing the nature to some extent, they're nurturing the nature, they comb the forest, they cultivate the grass. So everything is being associated with the colonialist practice, therefore. Now, what happens, we can identify that if we think about the history of colonization, then certainly we will find that this is not a kind of a truth that to be believed. Okay, because, deliberately some particular historical part has been erased in here. So here, with a particular reference to the term like uncombed forest or maybe the uncultivated grass, you will find certainly that the settlers are coming there and ultimately they could find that it is the forest where nobody actually traded before. Okay, it's the untrodden territory that I have already mentioned. The grass is being uncultivated, so it's a kind of either it's a barren land or maybe it's a particular jungle or wood that was dense forest where no people actually lived. Now, when you are just entering into that particular location, when you are going to that location, when you are entering into the forest, you are trying to name that forest according to something else. And now the question is whether, with the particular reference to that particular naming, will you change the dimension of this particular place? No, it cannot be. Can you produce a kind of elegance there with the particular process of naming? No, it is not to be considered as elegant any longer, because if you are adding an extra dimension to that by naming, you cannot change its geographical orientation. You cannot change its topographical orientation. You cannot change its condition, obviously. So now the question is, where was their elegance? Whether it is the uncombed forest or in uncultivated grass, where was their elegance? Except in their mockery. So the mocking orientation is always there. Now, in the book entry, it has been pointed out that the Walcott seems to affirm that it is irony rather than nostalgia that influences the naming of the New World. The untamed terrain of the New World bears no resemblance to the sophisticated elegance of Europe. So therefore, you will find it is not to be considered as a kind of a similarity, as a kind of resemblance to be found. Rather, it is nothing but a kind of mockery, to be specific. So to justify this particular orientation, Walcott is referring to the different kinds of names here. You see that where are the courts of Castile? Probably you have heard the name of the Castile. Castile was in during the Middle Ages, the Castile was a powerful state in the Iberian Peninsula. So it said that where were the courts of Castile? Versailles colonnades supplanted by cabbage palms. Okay. So fundamentally, you will find in this particular reference, in this particular stanza, there are ample references of some contrasts. Different kinds of contrasts are here, whether it is the matter with Castile and Versailles or the Corinthian crests and something. and in place of that you will find the cabbage palms, okay, and maybe the pigsty and the sour apples, green grapes, everything you can find. So somehow at one point here you will find that there are ample references on some places which have, you know, big names with them. Why I'm stating big name? Because it had a big history, okay, behind. So therefore, whenever you are thinking in terms of the terms like Castile or maybe the Versailles, or maybe you will find the reference of the Corinthian crest, then ultimately these are being associated in terms of some historical orientation. It had its own history, it had its own position, and ultimately it had its own weightage. And now you are just, if you just to some extent you are just naming, okay, just following Castile, just following Versailles, just following the Corinthian crest, you are just naming a particular place according to that particular name. Does it mean to be anything positive? If there is the pigsty, if there is the names for the sour apples and green grapes and something, and just you are just changing that particular name into Versailles or just changing this particular name to Castile, then does it signify something extra? So the question is there. So in the previous section, where he is actually operating in terms of the ironic orientation to the naming process, whether it can change the actual dimension of that particular place, this particular stanza is actually justifying that particular remark. Say for example, if you think of the Versailles colonnade, it refers to the architectural splendor of the Palace of Versailles, located in the suburb of Versailles outside Paris. Okay, that is in the France region or something. Versailles was the center of political power from 1682 until the beginning of the French Revolution in 1789. As such, it is seen as a symbol representing the absolute monarchy. It is in this context that Walcott appears to use the place or palace as a symbol of the grand and glorious past of the colonizer. So if you think in terms of Castile, if you think in terms of Versailles, then ultimately these are referring to the actual saints, the actual glorious past of the colonizer. And now if you are using the same name, okay, in case of the cabbage palm, so for example, this mundane cabbage palm offers a striking contrast to the grandeur and splendor of Castile and Versailles. Okay, so where were the courts of Castile? Versailles colonnade supplanted by cabbage palms with Corinthian crests, belittle diminutives. Okay, so what you can find that Walcott uses here some irony to address the varied ways in which the colonizer addresses his alienation from Europe, whether by transplanting architectural patterns or shortening names associated with the old world into diminutives, or by recreating versions of monuments and architectural marvels and adding the particular prefix little, you know, belittling, little Versailles here. So fundamentally what I'm trying to suggest here, that there is a striking contrast, there is a striking difference between the West and the East. With a particular process of naming, with a particular process of, you know, feeling that somehow you are feeling like home, just transferring some few items, just transferring the names, it would not do. Fundamentally, the kind of cultural aberration, the kind of cultural difference and alienation that a settler is facing on the verge of colonization, ultimately these are somehow very much striking and very much problematic to the colonizer himself. So that's why it has been stated that where were the courts of Castile? Versailles colonnade supplanted by cabbage palms with Corinthian crests. Belating diminutives, you see, that have been pointed out. Then little Versailles meant plans for a pigsty. Very much problematic, you see. The term little. So in case of the pigsty, you are just using little Versailles there. Names for the sour apples and green grapes of their exile. So you can identify that the poet are making some saronic references to the fact that the grandeur of the old world cannot be reinvented in a new. You cannot change everything. You cannot just bring back your old past. Okay, all the processes, all the desires, all the wishes, all the activities that you are doing in changing everything, you can change that. It cannot be the original one. So fundamentally, it will be very much problematic to you. You are to some extent, it is a kind of an exile to you. In spite of the colonizer's attempts to acclimatize himself with the new world, through naming the new world after the old, all efforts at doing so are futile machinations of an exile. You are trying to justify it. You are trying to feel like home. You are trying to make this particular world similar with the past world, but it cannot be. There is a big difference in between. And that's why it says that memory turned acid, but the name's held. So generally you will find that these particular references are providing the extra impetus to the memories, and so the memory turned acid, what kind of memory is being incorporated. Now if you think in terms of the colonizer, then certainly you will find that the memories is a hurting to some extent, as you can feel at that very moment that no, I cannot change anything. So therefore the memories, these are provided to be acidic to you. Okay, so they are memory turned acidic. The memory turned acid, it provides some problems, some wounds within you, but the name's held. The memory of the lost past makes one bitter, you see. However, the names christened on the new world in remembrance of this past remain. The names are there, but the memory of the past never been revived. Okay? You are thinking that, okay, I am just naming a particular place according to the, say, Old Hampshire or Nottinghamshire. Okay? But does it change the particular memory that is hurting you each and every moment? As he has pointed out, the speaker has pointed out, that with a certain reference to the similarities, ironically, the similarities has turned into the differences. In place of similarity, there are the differences. In place of resemblances, there are the contrasts. And each and every moment, the names are there, truly, the names held, but the memory turned acid or acidic. Valencia glows with the lanterns of oranges. So you can find the difference. You can find the contrasts. If you think in terms of Valencia, you will find that Valencia is a port city on the Iberian Peninsula in Spain and is renowned for its oranges, truly. The city was founded after the Roman soldiers settled there in the 2nd century BCE, and as such has a long history within. So Valencia glows with the lanterns of oranges. Maero's charred candelabra of cocoa. So what is Maero? Maero is a town on the island of Trinidad. So if you think about Valencia, if you think about Maero, they have their own origins. They have their own treasures. The natural treasures are there. If you think in terms of the oranges, if you think in terms of cocoa, the charred candelabra of cocoa. Okay, what is charred candelabra? You will find that the particular term charred, it means the burnt. And candelabra, it is referring to the candle stand. You know what happens that when in the churches, the candle stands are there and these are branched to some extent. So that particular identification, that particular outlook can be associated with the tree of cocoa. So charred candelabra of cocoa. And in Maero, the cocoa plants actually grow, and the cocoa can be found to be present there. It appears like a candelabra, therefore. So what I'm trying to suggest that whether it is the Valencia, whether it is the matter with Maero, you will find that they have their own treasures. Whether Valencia glows with the lanterns of oranges or Maero's charred candelabra of cocoa. Okay, the names have been changed, but ultimately its originations cannot be changed. Being men, they could not live except they first presume the right of everything to be a noun. So what is being originated, what is being pointed out here? Walcott refers to the Eurocentric need for order, structure, classification, naming, and everything. He says, being men, they could not live except they first presume the right of everything to be a noun. So why noun? Because noun refers to the naming one. So ultimately, whenever you are trying to live, though you cannot change its originality, though you cannot change the particular treasures and the way it actually behaves regarding its geographical orientation, regarding its economic orientation, you can change them. But as you are a person, you are a superior one, you are the colonizer, being men, they could not live except they first presumed the right of everything to be a noun. So ultimately, everything has been measured in terms of the name. Without a name, name provides you the identity, and with the shifting of the name, the identity also changes. It actually being taught by the colonizers there. The African acquiesced. What is acquiesced? The very term acquiesced means it is accepted reluctantly but without protest. So the Africans accepted. It's not that they wanted to accept it, but ultimately they acquiesced. They accepted that. They didn't protest them, but they accepted reluctantly. The Africans accepted, repeated, and changed them. So generally, what has been pointed out here, that the poet is alluding to the introduction of the white man's language to the African narrative. That when you are just providing the name, along with the name, you are actually providing the particular formation of language. And the Africans, it is not that the Africans actually protested against that infiltration of language, but they acquiesced. They repeated them. And to some extent, a Creole has been incorporated. It has been stated that the poet alludes to the introduction of the white man's language to the African native. The African received these foreign languages and names, and in speaking the foreign language with the native tongue, altered and appropriated that very language as his own. So in the process of repetition, a Creole has been originated. I have already referred to the particular term pidgin and Creoles, how the Creoles have been formed when any particular language has been infiltrated and any particular language has been coming to any particular culture. With that very culture, with that very pronunciation ability, with that geographical locations, and certainly both the accents are merging to some extent. And now it has been there, a kind of different kinds of English that is called the African English. Today, when you are reading with the linguistic perspectives, when you are thinking in terms of the linguistic orientations, you will find certainly that the language, say for example English, now English has been considered to be different kinds of English. It is not the English, rather Englishes to be specific. And that's why you will find the Australian English, you will find the American English, now it is the Indian English, it is the African English to be specific. So different kinds of English is there. Okay, so far as its lexicons are concerned, syntax patterns are concerned, and specifically the pronunciation and the accentuations, everywhere a different kind of orientation actually taken place. And this is called the Creole to some extent, because you know in that particular formation of English, you will find there are some African terms, the African terminology, the African accent, the African words, the mother tongue interference, everything actually happened to be specific, that a new form of English have come, and it is the Creole form actually. Okay, and you know what happens that after the creation of this particular Creole, when the children are taken birth, then these have become the mother tongue. So that's why their mother tongue becomes a kind of a Creole, a kind of different kind of English that they appropriated. So the African acquiesced and they repeated them and changed them. And therefore, you will find there are some terms being incorporated just to justify these words, you see. Now you will find to some extent it's a kind of a as if like a classroom. So it has been stated in this particular way, almost dramatic, you know, a dramatic orientation has been added to this particular poem. Therefore, listen, my children, say Mobai, it means the hog plum. Cerise, it means the wild cherry. Bela, it means the bay. So these are the terms you can see. These are nothing but the French terms. Whether it is the Momai, that means, you know, it's a hog plum in their own tongue. If you think in terms of cherries, it means the wild cherry, and Bela, that means the bay. So fundamentally, you will find that somehow, listen, my children, say, this can be oriented from two different angles. First, It may be that the colonizer is speaking to the native people. Listen, my children, say this and this and this. You have to accumulate that particular language. You have to know these terms. And with the help of these terms, you have to learn that how these terms are occurring in our language. So it might be that a colonizer is speaking to the native people, the native Africans. And another point you can be said that in a typical colonial classroom, when the classroom teaching is going on and the master or the teacher is teaching the same to the native students. So from that particular angle can it be there. So listen, my children, say, Mobile the hop plum, cerise or cerise, the wild cherry, Bela means bay. With a fresh green voices, you see. What does it mean? So ultimately here you will find this, the green voices refers to the untutored speech of the native who are trying to learn a foreign tongue. So therefore, what happens in this particular note entry, it has been pointed out, the poet seems to indicate the derogatory and patronizing way in which the colonizer would speak to the African native, presuming that the natives were without intelligences. It could also seemingly allude to a colonial classroom that I have already mentioned, where the native children are taught European languages. Since the Caribbean islands have been colonized by the French and the English, both these languages have percolated into the Caribbean sensibility. It is interesting to note that the French words in this depiction are being translated into English and not in indigenous language. That is very specific. From French, you have the English term. It is not that from French, you have the African language. That is very significant. That means from one colonizer's language to another one. So such a kind of orientation is there. And the children, or maybe the native people, native Africans, they are with their fresh green voices. They were once themselves in the way the wind bends or our natural inflections. So that has been pointed out that they are using the children, or maybe the native Africans, they are with their fresh green voices, with the untutored speech, the natives are trying to learn a foreign tongue. The Walcott is referring to the indigenous culture and identity of the native before the introduction of the colonizer's own language and culture. So therefore it has been stated that with the fresh green voices, they were once themselves. So once, it is the pre-colonial period, they were just like themselves in the way the wind bends, our natural inflections. Fundamentally, what is happening there, you see, that rather than the indigenous language of the native is inherent to his own identity. Now, when you are just with the help of this language, with the help of this linguistic exploitation, or rather in the process of colonization, when you are using the language, you are teaching them the language, and fundamentally you are negating their originality. So that's why that particular thing has been pointed out here by the poet here. And when it is being stated that with the fresh green voices is referring to their own voice, referring to their originality, they were once themselves. That means they were true to themselves because they actually belong to their own culture, their own African culture. And they always tried to, infiltrate, or they're trying to, express their own opinions, okay, with the help of their own languages. They were like themselves. They actually behaved the way the wind bends our natural inflections. Now, the natural inflection is obviously referring to the indigenous language, to be specific. So, how the indigenous language transferred our ideologies. The indigenous language, language is coming from our own ideology. What is going on within our brain, the repertoire that have been created within our brain, the particularization of your own culture, and the transformation has been done in the term of language, and that very language you are speaking. So you have it has its own repertoire within your mind. When you are speaking in your mother tongue, you needn't have to think about what you have to say. And continuously it is coming through you. And each and every word, the culture, is the culture-specific language, you see. Language is always culture-specific. So fundamentally, when you were using your own native tongue, it was natural inflections. Own native tongue, it considers that you were once within yourselves. But when you are changing them, fundamentally, your own originality changes along with the change in the language. So with the linguistic orientation, certainly the particular reference to your own identity cost changes. So therefore, you can identify that these palms are greater than Versailles, for no man made them. So ultimately, you will find a kind of direct difference has been pointed out. That when, if you think in terms of Versailles, the castle of Versailles, the colonnades of Versailles, you will find that this was man-made. Now, when you are the Africans, you have your own native origin, you have your own native identity. If you think about the palm trees, you will find that this is not being created by any human being. So I have to consider it's natural. Something is natural and something is artificial. Which is greater? Obviously the natural one. If you think about the natural ability of an African and something that has been learned in the classroom, then which is greater, or which one is greater? Obviously that is coming from your inherent part. So fundamentally, with the landscaping orientation, with the particular formation of detailing regarding nature and natural predicaments, you will find certainly that this is giving us the hint towards the identity discourse that have been created throughout the poem. It says, therefore, these palms are greater than Versailles, for no man made them. Their fallen columns greater than Castile, no man unmade them. So therefore, you will find that these are, rather than comparing the architectural marvels of Europe with those of the Caribbean, Walcott here draws attention to the natural beauty and vegetation of the island, which have no replica in Europe. So now everybody were trying to replicate anything. That particular replica is not being found in Europe. And now you will find that when it is being stated that these palms are greater than Versailles, for no man made them, their fallen columns greater than Castile, no man unmade them, except the worm who has no helmet, but was always the emperor. So this is very significant. You see, it's a kind of an orientation being provided with a particular reference to the natural discourses that have been created here. Is the eco-critical orientation is being added. Okay, and fundamentally you will find certainly that regarding the unmaking of the Castile, the castle of Castile, except the worm, because it is natural, there is no helmet. So when people actually had dilapidated, or maybe people, just destroyed the castle of Castile, they wore the helmets. So therefore, the helmets are representing the particular power, the authority. The helmets are representing the particular power that have been, being endorsed at the time of destroying Castile. So now, here you will find that the worms are there. That is very natural. That is very associated with nature, and they have to be treated as the emperor. Therefore, okay, they are their own emperor. They are their own kings. So what you can find, it actually refers to the fact that the coming and going of various regimes results in the destruction of significant architectural sites by the men in power. In the Caribbean, the growth and destruction of the verdant topography is obviously organic. The measly worm consumes the vegetative matter, as we know. However, it has no superficial markers of power or authority, like the helmet of an emperor in the civilized world. So therefore, if you compare with them something natural and something artificial, it has to be stated, so far as the cultural differences are concerned, we have to state that the natural is always greater, the natural is always better, the natural is always superior with in response to something that is artificial. And then it has been stated, and children, look at these stars over Valencia's forest. So again, the same orientation is there, as I've already mentioned. So when it has been stated that the children, so the same orientation has been there. Just previously what I have said, that might be the colonizer is speaking to the native people, or maybe a colonial teacher, or maybe a teacher in the colonial classroom is speaking to the children, that is the students. And children, look at these stars. Again, the reference to the stars. The stars have been pointed out at the very first section of this poem. And now it has been repeated. It has been stated that our children, look at these stars over the Valencia's forest. Not Orion, not Betelgeuse. Tell me, what do they look like? So, when you are just speaking on something, in a typical classroom, now you are to some extent providing a particular angle. You were just demonstrating, just look at the stars, look at the constellation. You know, Orion is the constellation that appears like a hunter with a sword and a belt, and the Betelgeuse is a bright star we know. So just pointing towards them, not Orion, not Betelgeuse. Just look at the stars over the Valenciennes forest. Tell me, what do they look like? And then the term, answer you damned little Arabs. When this term has been there, the damned little Arabs, the poet actually depicts a racist predilections of the colonizers and their pejorative use of the racial identity. As you can find, the insults are there, and you know the particular formation of slurs being introduced. Okay, this is the way actually they consider the Arabians, or maybe the people from the colonized lands. So answer you damn little Arabs. And they actually answer, it's the first time they're answering actually, sir, it looks like the fireflies caught in the molasses. So that is the difference, you see. Molasses, you know, molasses is this particular appeal of the colonizer's language, history and culture for the native is compared to a firefly's attraction to molasses. What happens, you know? What actually does? Fireflies, when they're attracted to the molasses, you know, it's a kind of a sweetener, okay, a kind of a food and prepared, you know, the sweetener actually. So what happens when the fireflies are attracted to the molasses, they go there and being caught. So that's why the firefly's attraction to the molasses. However, like the firefly that is trapped in molasses, the native finds himself trapped within the regard for the invader's culture. That is a threat to his own indigenous cultural identity. So you are being attracted to the culture of the invaders. And fundamentally, being attracted to the invaders' culture, being attracted to the colonizers' culture, you were just running towards them, and just like a firefly, which is, you know, completely being trapped within the molasses and being caught there and they die. Similarly, you will find that regarding the indigenous cultural identity, that would be certainly being destroyed with the close adherence with the culture of the invader, a close adherence, close attraction towards the culture, towards the language of the colonizer. So that is being originated, that has been pointed out towards the end of this particular part. Now, though they consider that as if like in a molas, and then the stars can be related with the fireflies, but with the reference to the fireflies caught in the molasses, actually that particular problem regarding the identity, problem regarding the life and the life thread that is being posited here, all these have been taken in consideration therefore. So in this particular way, a kind of a warning has been provided to the people who are continuously being associated with their particular culture. As I've already mentioned, that though we are reading an African poem, but we, the Indians, are always facing the same. In a typical colonial classroom or colonial orientation of the classroom, when we are reading English, and fundamentally, if we are very much, you know, to some extent attracted, just like the fireflies, with the culture of the Britishers, then certainly we will be entrapped into that particular culture, and we will be completely being killed. Our own identity, our own culture, this will be completely being destroyed by the typical Western narrative. And this grand narrative will obviously subside the smaller narratives of ourselves. And we will no longer find ourselves, or no longer found ourselves, ultimately in this particular, with the original existence. So that is the kind of a thread that has been provided here. It is not being directly being spoken, but in an ironic and in an oblique way it has been stated. And we, as the people of a typically colonized land, okay, colonized country, and we are carrying the same neo-colonial orientation within us, and ultimately we should be aware about this particular problem. Okay, so with that particular reference, the text comes to an end. So up to this.